Hello, Vern. How are you?
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you for doing this. And we've been following each other on LinkedIn, and I've seen many of your conversations and views and things that you put forward. And that's why I was interested in Democracy First platform and the policies and things that you are putting forward. And I thought it will be good that people can also hear a lot more of your presentations and views. So here we are, um, and this is your platform. But before we start, I'll let you introduce yourself, and then Democracy First, and then we'll start from there.
Thanks very much. Well, by background, I'm a historian, and I did a lot of historical research many years ago now into Australian history. And a lot of Australians, I'm sad to say, don't know a lot about our history and think that nothing much has happened in our short history. In fact, at the end of the 19th century, Australia was regarded around the world as probably the most democratic, most innovative, most egalitarian country on the planet. That was our global reputation. A term that was often used in the 1880s was that Australia is the social laboratory of the world. The social laboratory of the world. This is quite extraordinary. And this happened because we had the establishment of full democracy in our parliaments earlier than any other country in the world except Norway, leaving aside Switzerland and countries that had kind of parliaments that emerged from the medieval period. But in the modern world, we were pretty much the start. We had full democracy, that is, without any property or wealth requirement in order to vote. And then we were amongst the first countries to allow women to vote. We developed an interesting electoral system, which I think is still probably one of the best in the world. And yet, and on top of all that, we were one of the most prosperous countries in the world in the year 1900, at the time of our federation. We were up there with Argentina. And Australia and Argentina were very similar countries back then. We were settler societies. We were blessed with a lot of natural resources, so we produced wool, wheat, minerals, gold especially, which we sold to the world. And that made us one of the wealthiest countries in the world. When you roll the dice forward now, 100 years, 120 years later, and all that has changed, and it's changed in a way that's not good. In many ways, we've lost that reputation as being a leading country in the world in many ways. We're not an innovative country in technology, in science, in the new industries that are shaping the world, whether it's in robotics or AI or satellite technology. Australia's not up there. We are lagging behind in all these areas, and we've stopped innovating in social areas. Our democracy needs renovation. It's stagnating in many ways. So we're kind of falling behind the advanced world in a lot of ways. And when you think back to the many advantages that Australia has because of our climate, our geography, our relatively safe place in the world, we haven't really made the most of those things. And so I think there's a big question mark about the future of Australia. And that is the reason primarily why we formed Democracy First at the beginning of 2024, because we wanted to say to Australians, despite a lot of good advantages that we've had, we've actually run ourselves into a fairly problematic place now in the world, and we need to do some hard thinking. about our future in both in the political sense, in the economy. We need to think about national security in a lot of new ways from the way we've thought about them in the past. So for all those reasons, we formed Democracy First because there's a lot to do in renovating our democracy.
Wonderful. And when you talked about, like, from an historical point of view, that point of view is very important, especially from people like me who are migrants here. So we need a crash course on where Australia came from and how did it in 200 years became one of the wealthiest countries on in the world stage. So that's a good context in which we should have this conversation, even in all conversations ahead. So one thing, when you set up your Democracy First, I was looking at statistics, and in the last 22 elections, 31% of the first preferences were for non-major parties, not for Labour. What do you think explains this dissatisfaction of voters with the two major parties?
I think it's not difficult to understand. You've got to remember that both parties were formed a long time ago. The Labor Party is one of the oldest political parties in the world. The only one that is older is the British Conservative Party. So Labor was formed in 1891 in Western Queensland by a group of shearers and pastoral workers. And if you think about that, and you think that a political party formed at that time, in that context, is still the governing party in Australia 135 years later, that's quite astonishing, really, because the world of that time is a very different world from 2025. Culturally, technologically, it's unrecognisable. So it's no real surprise that a political party that formed in 1891 is going to look a little bit not really fit for purpose in 2025. And I think the Labor Party is now suffering from a lot of things that just mean its time has passed now. It was formed by trade unions when most workers were members of trade unions. Today, only 9% of workers are members of trade unions. So being a trade union party doesn't really resonate that well with most people. It was formed by essentially unskilled workers. Today, very small percentage of our population work in the occupations that have been traditionally associated with Labor's history. So for all those reasons, Labor and developed a method of organisation, basically where it had to operate in a big country. It had to find a way to keep its members on the same page. So it developed a very strict internal system of basically requiring all of its members to agree with party decisions, and if they dissented, they were basically expelled. All of these things, when you look at them today, suggest this is an organisation that is no longer suited to the 21st century. And I think that's how people feel about the Labor Party. Then if you look at the Liberals, they were formed in 1944, when Australia was still in the Second World War. And the world of 1944 is also a very different world from today. The Liberal Party was basically formed as a merger of a lot of small parties who came together to defeat Labor. And their primary reason for existence was always to defeat Labor. What they actually stood for, well, that's a secondary thing. And they've never really had they've never really, been all that clear about what they stand for. The first thing they're clear about is that they are set up to defeat Labor. Now, the trouble with that is that as the years have gone by, and as Labor has stagnated, the Liberal Party in turn has stagnated, because the circumstances in which both parties are formed are now wildly removed from the culture and circumstances of Australia in 2025. Combined with that, I think, as well as that, both parties have really become captured by professional politicians. So when they were both formed, in the early years of both parties, they had a wide range of people who was members. They had people who would become members of parliament who were train drivers, farmers, doctors, engineers, wide range of occupations. That no longer happens. The people who run both parties are essentially professional, career politicians who leave university, become a staffer for a Labor or Liberal politician, and then move up the ladder until they themselves become a politician. And what that has meant over a number of decades is that the culture of both parties is really quite disconnected from all of the strands in Australian society, whether it's the culture of young people, whether it's the culture of older Anglo people, whether it's the culture of new migrant communities. It's largely cut off from all of them, really, and they kind of operate in a little bubble. And I think most people, even those who are not all that interested in politics, have come to realise that people who form our politicians are not broadly representative of the whole community. They tend to be representative, in fact, of a fairly small slice of the population. So I think that has meant that since the 1980s, the proportion of people who vote for one of the two major parties has been in steady decline. And it's actually been a period of 4 decades now where that process of decline has been operating. And it's got to the point now where the combined vote for others is bigger than the vote for Labor, and depending on which poll you look at, it's almost bigger than the vote for Liberal. And so that means it's a whole new ball game now, because the continued existence of Labor and Liberal is no longer assured. They might continue to limp along for the years to come, but the downward trajectory, I think, in support is one that I think is going to continue. And that means that there will be new movements that emerge that try to fill that vacuum. There will be independents, some on the left, some on the right, some in the centre, and there will be new movements that try to put some of the pieces together. What we've wanted to do in Democracy First is to say, people, there's a process of change going on in our politics. That process will continue. What we should do is just try to put together the pieces to create a sensible, thoughtful, mainstream political movement, broadly based in the centre, but which is capable of governing, capable of making good decisions, and in particular, capable of thinking in the medium to long term about the interests of the country. Because one of the things that I think many people strongly dislike about politics in the way it's evolved is that there is very little long-term thinking. Politicians in both Liberal and Labor essentially look to the next election. Their decision making is oriented to what will serve them well in the next election. But there's no thinking about where should Australia be in 5 or 10 or 20 years from now. And that's a big weakness, and it's one that we somehow have to find a way to solve.
So when you talk about there's a range of minor parties coming in, and you also in that position. So where do you think, how would you pose yourself? Because in practical terms, there's been all these opinion polls giving that it might be a Labour minority government supported by Greens. And the Prime Minister sometimes says he'll take support from them or not support take from them. And then he has already been talking with Teal MPs. So when that combination is already in play, that Labour might form a government with Greens or Teal, where do you think you'll be located and in influencing the policies and the governance forward?
Well, one of the things that happened over the last 3 decades, 4 decades, as the two traditional parties stagnated and as they became quite narrow in the social composition, and as they became, but also very much captured by career politicians. One of the things that happened then is that they tended to sort of mirror each other in a lot of areas. So in a whole lot of policies, they would essentially adopt the same position. If that looked as though, if there was a controversial policy where perhaps half of one party wants one position and half wants the other position, often the way they would just manage that is by just agreeing with the other major party, because it then diffuses the issue and it stops division. What that meant was that the new parties that have emerged over the last 40 years have tended to be then on the extremes. You've had One Nation to the right of Liberal, the Greens to the left of Labour. Then you've got Clive Palmer, who is kind of also to the right of Liberal, although a bit hard to place. Then you've got Teals and other grouping, Teals who are also not easy to place in some ways, but nevertheless they tend to sort of fall socially to the left of Labour as well. And what that has meant that you've got the two-party system in a slightly revised form. You've got coalitions of Labour, Greens, Teals on the one side, and a coalition of Liberal, National, One Nation, perhaps Clive Palmer on the other side. The result of that is that there's a big gap in the centre, which is ironically where most people are. But people in the centre tend not to be activists. They tend not to form political movements. It's people on the extremes who tend to be the activists. They form new parties. They form the groups that like to be active in setting the agenda. That has meant we've got a big vacuum in the centre. I would say there's a big vacuum in the mainstream centre, which tends to mean that the debate on a whole range of questions is a very polarised debate. So if you take the energy issue, for instance, you've got a very polarised debate between Labour, Greens, Teals on one side. They are fully in support not only of renewables, but enormous public subsidy for renewables. And then on the other side, you have a kind of traditional support for coal and gas, which has been overtaken more recently by a coalition support for nuclear, and not only support for nuclear, but public support, public funding, public subsidies for nuclear power on a very large scale and a very expensive scale. So there's a very polarised situation on energy. The thing about that polarised situation is that it just doesn't serve us very well. In reality, we need a mix of all kinds of energy sources. We should try and have a competitive market with all of our energy sources, and those that are effective and cheap should do well in that market. Those that are too expensive should not do well. And over time, there should be incentives for all of the energy providers to innovate, to become cheaper, to become more effective. That's how a market should work. But we don't have anything like a market in energy at the moment. It's totally politicized, and it's politicized around the extremes on either side. So I think most policy areas are like that. You get a very politicized and very polarized environment in which the optimal solutions tend to not be possible. We tend to have a choice between two not very good, ill-formed positions, and they'll be the positions that left and right offer us. But in fact, they're not the best positions. I mean, most of us would be able to devise a much better set of energy policy arrangements. If we sat down and thought about it with a group of experts, we could come up with something fairly easily. But it's not possible in our political environment because the activist groups who set the agenda have been able to do all the talking, essentially. And the people in what I'd call the common sense centre have tended to not have a voice. They've tended to not be represented in the debate, and the quality of the debate suffers as a result. So the question that you've asked is, if we're heading into a period in which minority governments are likely to become more common, what is the best thing that could happen, and what would we like to see happen? In short, we would like to see a growing number of crossbenchers who are in the centre, who are sensible, who are strategic in their thinking, and we would like to see less influence for the Greens on one side and for the hard right on the other side. And if that happens, you would get a better parliament, and you would get better decisions, I think. So in the coming election, it's my hope that there will be a number of good crossbenchers who are elected, who are in the centre, who are thinkers, who want to think strategically about the issues and what's in the best interests of the country, and who are not just going to push an ideological barrow on certain things, come hell or high water. So that's what I hope will happen.
It's interesting, and then you talked about the policies, and then we'll come to the policies, which are very big issues in this election. I just hadn't from my history. I come from India, and somewhere around 1980s, 1990s, there were a series of minority governments in India because no one was getting majority. So some minor parties will support the big parties and they will get into government. And that period of about 20, 25 years has seen just collapse of governments after governments. The minor parties will pull support on some issues. You don't like this, you pull issues, which led to a lot of instability and a lot of policy paralysis. And, we even had to pledge our sovereign gold to get some money. It reached that position. So do you think that kind of situation coming in Australia as well, where minor parties pulling the government down if you're not getting your piece of flesh?
I think we have had a number of crossbenchers in the Parliament in the last 20 years. And they've tended to be a mixed bag. So where there have been independents in the lower house, they've tended to act fairly responsibly across the board, whether they're, Teals or centrists or a Bob Katter on the right. They've all tended to act fairly responsibly. In the Senate, it's been different because you tend to have small parties who get represented in the Senate and they tend to be much more ideological. They tend to sort of make demands and will, do what they think is necessary if their demands are not met. And I would say the quality of those small parties in the Senate has generally been very poor. They're not really thinkers. They're not really people who are problem solving oriented. They tend to be motivated by grievances. They want to prosecute one issue usually, maybe a couple of issues that they're interested, but by and large, they don't have a broad set of policy interests, and so they haven't really performed very well. So what I'd hope, and this is one of the reasons why we formed Democracy First, is that we need to have probably one, maybe two or three, but certainly one new political movement in Australia that represents people who are thinkers, innovators, entrepreneurs, people who are problem solvers, people who can, make a good contribution to public debate, who can think long term about things. So to me, that is the most important priority at the moment. How do we get people like that into Parliament? And I think it would be a good thing if we, as a new movement that aims to assist people like that to get elected, if we could have some success in getting some people elected, because I think the need for them is a strong need. We just need to have better people across the board in our Parliament. We need, people we just need more thinkers and innovators and business people who are natural leaders, not just party officials. So I think across the board, that's what we need to happen in our parliaments. And I've found in the last couple of years, most Australians see this very clearly. Most Australians are very dissatisfied with the kind of people who are in politics. And this applies to people in Labor and Liberal parties as much to anyone else. They're often very frustrated with the kind of people that they now see running their parties, because traditionally they had a very much broader range of people in them. So I think it's a cultural problem that's happened over a number of decades, and we need to come up with some solutions to that problem.
Good. So now, because we discussed, you've already told about your energy policy and need for much more competition in the markets. Like, you have a mix of things. And interestingly, when I was in India, I was learning on these energy policies, working in a power company. What they did was, like they said, we'll base our energy needs on coal and gas. Gas is costly, but mostly coal. What we'll do is we'll let solar energy power areas which are hard to reach. So if it's in hills or if it's in deep jungles or somewhere, then let solar do that, because there's no need for transmission lines. But we'll base our things on coal and then supported by hydro. So there's a huge mix of energy coming from different sources, and now they are going big in other sources as well. So that's a good idea. But taking that thing forward, I like your insights on what, or maybe your solutions, central solutions on the big issues on this election. And I think the biggest one is cost of living. Both parties have given their own solutions on how they are going to possibly manage it. I think Labour is more of subsidizing the costs which are going up so that the people don't feel the pain. And Liberals are, I think, doing that. Will try to cut down red tape and reduce the cost and bring more competition in. What do you think? How are you going to solve that cost of living issue?
Well, I think you're right. The Labor response is to essentially use taxpayers' money to offset the rising cost of things, which is at best a short-term solution, but probably more accurately a quite ineffective solution, because unless we stop rising costs of living, then we're just going to need more and more subsidies to enable many people to meet basic household costs. So that's unsustainable. Now, the Liberals say they will try to reduce the costs of these things. And then, that's what and I think that's right. That's the obvious solution, is to try to reduce the costs. The question is, how do you do that? And if you look through the main areas of where the cost pressures are, one of them is in energy. We need, I think, to do a major change in energy policy so that we do get something like a competitive market in energy. I don't think the Liberals have really got very far in their thinking about that. They've tended to put all their eggs in the nuclear basket and hope that that will make a difference. But even if everything went very well, there will be no impact for the next 15 years. So it's not a short-term solution. The cost of rent and mortgages is another big pressure. And again, everyone would aim to try to reduce the cost of housing. But this is a very difficult thing to achieve as well. We have a pattern of housing, of population and development in Australia in which our people are concentrated in a handful of very large cities. That means the price of land in those cities is very expensive. It's the second highest land in the world in terms of city living. It means housing is going to be very high in price. So, and yet at the same time, we sit in a country with vast space, with many small towns, 2 hours out of large population centres, which already have existing infrastructure, with declining populations. And the price of housing in these areas is a fraction of the cost of what it is in the capital cities. So addressing this kind of imbalance there is part of the answer. Immigration is obviously another driver of the housing problem, because if you have growing demand for housing but a fairly constant supply, then the price is just going to go up. But also, and in the more long term, I mean, there's also a big need for a lot of innovation in the way we do housing. We tended to have only two models in Australia for housing, which is a detached house on a suburban block, which is a good situation for a family, but in the city context, it's now unsustainably expensive. Or we have a growing number of high-rise apartment living arrangements, which again suit some people, but don't suit families and a number of other sections of the population very well. But we should have more than just two options. There are a whole range of ways in which we can provide low-cost housing options for single people, for elderly people who live on their own, for a sole parent with a couple of kids, maybe a household with a couple of adults cohabitating, maybe arrangements where you can have a cluster of half a dozen families sharing a block of land with 6 dwellings. Enormous range of options that should be on the table, but which we haven't developed in Australia because we tended to be stuck in some fairly traditional models, where if you're an innovator, you would say, we can do a whole lot of this much cheaper than the way it's traditionally been done. So yes, a whole lot of things that can be done in the housing area. The third one, I suppose, is groceries and those things. And again, it's very we have a very concentrated retail market in Australia. We have two retail companies which basically set the price on things like groceries because they have 80% market share. We just need much more competition in that area, and much more channels for a whole lot of grocery suppliers to be able to get their goods to the consumers cheaper. And again, that requires innovation, it requires some changes in competition policy, and all of those things are the things that are pushing up the costs of living. But the solutions are not easy, and by and large, both major parties are guilty of pretending that there are easy solutions to those problems when, in truth, there aren't.
Thank you. You talked about having different models of housing, like for singles and for small families and for senior citizens and things. When I came, I heard about the Australian dream, that house with a front yard and a backyard and things. That's the model of what everyone aspires for. So I think that will need a lot of change in modeling of how you see your Australian dream. But the other thing is that which your model of different size apartments would need the people moving. Like if I am a young person, I'll be in a smaller apartment, a studio apartment, then I'll go and buy a bigger house when I have a family, and then maybe downsize when I'm retired or something. What prevents those things is the high stamp duties, and stamp duties form a big chunk of any state government's revenue, which prevents that. You can't push down the stamp duty, not just for the first home buyers, but for everyone. The stamp duties are lower, people can move from house to house. If the stamp duties are higher, then they're not going to move. And that's why you see a lot of big houses where only one or two people live, but they're not downsizing. So, how do you think we can manage this stamp duty issue to encourage people to move and have that new thinking of a new model of housing? There's no one Australian dream.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, stamp duty is a tax that just is counterproductive. It should be abolished, and it requires, I think, it requires one state government to bite the bullet and to just scrap state stamp duty. Once one of them does it, that creates a lot of advantages for that state, which would attract a lot of investment and a lot of housing demand. So everyone knows that stamp duty should be scrapped. It's just that no state government has been able to come up with a plan to actually do it and start the process. I think it can be done. It just requires state governments to think more creatively about the range of taxation measures that they have. But yes, scrapping stamp duty and some property taxes, though not all of them, because there's a place for some of them. That's a no-brainer. That's something that should happen as soon as possible.
So I always think stamp duty to being a tax on tax. So if I earn something, I've already paid income tax on this. And with whatever remaining, I'm going to buy a house. I have to pay tax on that money. So it's a tax on tax. But I think there's a start in Queensland where they have got rid of stamp duty for the first home buyers altogether. So maybe that's a start. I'm not sure how that will go forward. But I think it's a good start there. And
that's
maybe
certainly true.
it can.
It's certainly true that you have. It's also the pattern in a lot of our cities that you have large established houses on very expensive bits of land in the centre of our cities, with one person living in them, or sometimes they're just empty for long periods. And this is obviously not sustainable, really. And so I think there just we need to have incentives for people to be able to make changes without incurring all of the tax obstacles that are in their way.
Good. So we discussed the cost of living, and which includes the housing and energy. The other biggest topic that is a bone of contention in this election is how much the government is going to spend and how much the Liberals are going to cut potentially. And when I checked, I think the 60% of all the revenues of a government goes into welfare funding, be it Centrelink, childcare, aged care, health, things like that. So, do you think that kind of spending is sustainable? It needs a lot of income tax to be created, and we are already at the highest collection of income taxes. So, we are a high taxing country and high spending on welfare expenditures. Do you think it is sustainable, or do you have any other alternate policies to manage this going forward? We are already reaching $1 trillion of debt.
Well, there are a number of things here. There's within the category of social spending, there's welfare spending or entitlements to various categories of people who rely on those payments for survival. Then there's another very big cluster of spending, which is health spending, and health spending is growing rapidly, and health costs are forecast to really blow out in the next 10 years. Jumping from something like 10% of GDP to 14-15% of GDP. So there are a whole range of specific issues that are driving that. Then there's a third thing, which are a range of government programs that come and go, but governments find it very easy to set up programs in these areas to address particular needs, but many of these are very ineffective. So I would say in this third area, and as someone who's very familiar with the social sector and with a range of government programs there, one of the things that happens is that people who don't know a lot about the social sector are very reluctant to say, oh, we should cut 10 million from a certain set of social programs. And they're very reluctant to do that because they can't really justify why that should be done and whether it will disadvantage anyone. I would say, as someone who's very familiar with the social sector, there are massive amounts of waste in these areas and so many programs that are just ineffective. If you look at an area like domestic violence programs or mental health programs or suicide prevention programs, these are areas where governments have increased spending a lot over the last 10 years. The community has wanted more done. The governments have responded to it. They've increased spending. But at the same time, the incidence of domestic violence continues to go up. The incidence of suicide continues to go up. Mental illness continues to go up. So there's a problem here. The programs are not bringing down the things that they're supposed to bring down. And in fact, the problems continue. So we have to conclude that a lot of the spending in these sorts of areas is ineffective, It's just flawed in its design. It doesn't prevent the problems that they seek to address. And then when you come to an area like NDIS, which is one that I know you have a lot of interest in, we see this problem on a big scale. Here's a whole sector of disability support which has now become a kind of mega bureaucracy scheduled to cost more than $100 billion a year by 2030. And yet, for all of that money, we know that there's still enormous inadequacy in support within the disability areas. Some areas are well served, some areas are still neglected. And it's astonishing that some areas can still be neglected despite all of the spending that has happened over the last 10 to 15 years in NDIS. So again, that says the programs that government has put in place, the way it does things, the tendency for things to bureaucratise and to become wasteful, this is a deep-seated problem in government, and it's especially a problem in the social sector. Well, one of the reasons it's especially a problem in the social sector is that neither Labor and Liberal are really able to solve these problems. Labor has a mindset that says, if we spend more money on a problem, we will solve it. All the evidence tells us this is not true at all. You can spend a lot of money on social problems and make no progress whatsoever. On the Liberal side, there's a different dynamic. The Liberals tend to be people who know a bit about business, they know a bit about industrial relations, they might know a bit about the rural sector, but they don't know about the social sector. They just don't know much about it. And so when they come into government, the Liberals don't know what to do, basically, about social sector reform. So they end up doing nothing. If you think of the 9 years of coalition government from 2013 to 2022, they were responsible for administering NDIS. Their spending on NDIS steadily went up. They didn't reform it. They didn't know how to reform it. Nothing happened. And this tends to be what happens with Liberal governments. So it's a major problem. It's a major problem on both sides. Labor and Liberal tend to have the wrong mindset to be able to reform these things. So, yes, I would say there are many cost savings that can be made in these areas, but you have to approach them with a mindset of wanting to reform social services across the board, to be very clear about what you want to achieve in a social service program, ensure that you achieve that, but strip away anything that is just bureaucracy for its own sake, anything that is just padding of government departments, because that's naturally what tends to happen in government departments if you let them go for 10 years or 20 years. So we just need a comprehensive approach to reforming the social sector in order to reduce spending. Because if you set out to reduce spending without reforming how it's done, you won't achieve anything.
It's interesting that I saw a Senate hearing, and in which the minister told that 83 or 85% of all the jobs that were created were government funded or subsidized in some way. So if you take them off, there's not much growth happening in the economy. So which means these jobs are being created in the care economy somewhere. That's the thing. And I read through your charter, and there's a lot of new ideas on solving the education spending, or even the this care industries, and NDIS and welfare. Do you want to expand on those policies or suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, it is extraordinary, I think, um, that the proportion of new jobs being created are overwhelmingly in the government-funded sectors. It's not just the care economy, but anything that's government funded will tend to be growing in employment. Um, anything in the anything that is in either manufacturing or the services sector, um, employment will be contracting, sometimes quite dramatically, and there is just no growth happening there at all. And this just points to the sort of broader economic predicament that we're in Australia, which is that we think we are an advanced economy, but in truth we have a very simple economy. It's very much reliant on the export of minerals, which we supplement with the export of agricultural products, most of them unprocessed, most of them not value added. And then they're the two big drivers in our economy. We don't produce much apart from those things. We manufacture virtually nothing. We don't innovate in terms of commercializing new ideas. We have quite good research institutions in the country, but they tend not to be able to commercialize the ideas that they develop. In 95% of cases, a good idea that they develop will be taken up overseas. So this is a major cultural problem that we have, and it's an economic problem. And one of the stunning figures is that Harvard has an index of countries. The 140 countries are rated according to their economic complexity. And this is a very interesting index because it tells you broadly how advanced a country is. And Australia was ranked number 55 on this index for economic complexity in the 1990s. Now, 55 out of 140 countries, that's not that good. It's not terrible. It's not, we're better than half of the others, but it's still not good. That was in the 1990s. In 2021, we had dropped down to number 93. 93 out of 140. In 2024, we've now dropped down to 102. So we are ranked not in the top 100 countries of the world in economic complexity. And a whole lot of quite poor third world countries are actually ranked higher than us now. This is extraordinary. I mean, Japan is number 1, and Switzerland is number 2, Germany is number 3, South Korea is number 4. Switzerland is a very interesting country because it used to be where we were in the 1990s. It was number 55. We were number 55 and it was also in the 50s. But since the 1990s, Switzerland moved from being ranked in the 50s to being ranked number 2 in the world in economic complexity. We went the other direction, down to 102. So, as a story about where the trends are in Australia, they're very disturbing, and I think these are the issues that raise very major questions for us about our long-term future in Australia. And we are going to have to sort of do some very hard thinking about this. And it's one of the issues, I guess, that in Democracy First, we are very mindful of, because if we say, which political party is really going to come up with creative solutions to this problem, the answer is probably not Labor and probably not Liberal. So it's going to have to come from somewhere else.
Yeah. So after that, those two issues, the biggest one, the next that's being fought these days is the immigration, the huge number coming in, which then affecting the demand on services or the renting or housing supply, things like that. So that's a big issue. So I like your views on those. Plus the social cohesion coming in because of all the campus fights and claims of Islamophobia and claims of anti-Semitism. These two things I think are tied in, but I'll let you go on those two issues.
Well, I think they're very big issues, both the immigration issue and then the social cohesion one. And generally, I would say in the last 4 decades, we haven't had a good public debate about either of these issues. We've tended to avoid it, partly because for a while there was a fear that, if someone was to criticise the immigration intake or want to reduce it, then they must be necessarily motivated by a racist mindset. And so, and again, when you think in the 1990s, when Pauline Hanson was first elected, her election had the effect of really killing off any debate about immigration, because if you even asked for a debate about immigration, you were regarded as being sympathetic to Pauline Hanson, and that had the effect of just closing down the debate. That's very unfortunate, because actually we do need a lot of public debate about immigration, and it's now beginning to happen. And it's important because what has happened because of the economic circumstances that we're in is that governments, particularly in the last 25 years, both Labor and Liberal, have tended to rely on immigration as their only economic growth strategy. That is, the only way they can really grow the Australian economy is by importing quite big numbers of consumers and home buyers and home renters. And this artificially changes our economic growth figures, because, if you bring in a couple of 100,000 additional people every year, you will automatically get 2% growth. Whether your economy is becoming any more productive or any more efficient, or whether you're exporting anything more, in a sense, that doesn't matter. If you just bring in a couple of 100,000 extra people, you will have 2% growth in the overall size of the economy. All of that has been very misleading, really, because it's given us a very false picture of the health of the Australian economy. In fact, we have declining productivity, we have declining wage growth, and that's been in decline for quite a long time now. And so the aggregate growth figures tend to hide all of these quite weak aspects of our economy. Then in the last few years in particular, both Liberal and Labor governments were quite happy to increase immigration quite significantly beyond the 200,000 a year mark, up to 500,000 a year, which we reached for a few years, which places us as the number one country in the world in terms of, the numbers of migrants in relation to the size of our population, which means that a number of aspects of that are going to be problematic. The housing dimension is going to be problematic. The social cohesion dimension is going to be problematic if you have such a large number of new arrivals coming in simultaneously. The strain on infrastructure is going to be problematic, especially in the big cities. And then the strain on education services is going to be difficult. So all of these things have happened. And at the same time, we're not really trying to address the fundamental flaws in our economies, whereby we can produce more and export more. We've tended to be content to just bringing in more people who can buy more fridges and more cars. So that's the immigration issue is to a large extent an economic issue, and it's about, I guess, the failure of our economic models now to really work for us in the 21st century. So we're going to have to devise a new economic model that is not dependent on immigration. That's the first point. And the second point is then the social cohesion one. And this is also, a great interest of mine, because I think in the last 30 years in Australia, it's become quite fashionable to say multiculturalism has worked very well. It's been a great success story. Look at all the ethnic restaurants we now have on offer in any suburban shopping strip. Now, ethnic cuisine is great, but this is not the point, really. The point is, do we have good social participation from all of the people who now call Australia home? And in truth, some migrant communities have not integrated very well. Some have done it better than others. Some have done it not very well. And there are still, many migrant communities where participation in the wider society is poor. It's just it's not well developed. People find it easier just to mix with their own ethnic group rather than to mix in the wider community. And if it's too difficult for people to mix in the wider community, they will tend to hesitate to do that. And so there are some places in Australia where there are real tensions around these questions that, again, we've tended to shy away from. We've tended to say, instead of having an open discussion about this, we've tended to ignore it and hope that it will just fix itself. And what usually happens is that things like this don't fix themselves. Then on top of all that, in the last 12 months, we've had quite a lot of tension in the world between Jewish and Muslim people, which has been triggered by the events in Israel and Palestine. Now, this is also a very complex issue, but it's raised the question of, to what extent do migrant communities in Australia have a license to champion causes in their own country, especially when those causes are very divisive, indeed, violent, as in this case. So many people on the right who are sympathetic to Israel now say there is a rise in anti-Semitism in Australia. I don't think there is, actually. I don't think there is a lot of anti-Semitism in Australia. I think there's a lot of criticism of Israel, but that's a different thing. And then you have some sections of the Muslim community who in their reaction to the events in Gaza will tend to adopt a kind of hostility to some sections of the Jewish community, whether they act on it or not. It's been difficult for harmonious relations. Now, my view again is that we should be much more open about the difficulties of these kinds of disputes, and we should be a bit more hard-headed in saying that if you've come to Australia and you have a Jewish background or a Muslim background, you need to check. You need to check your desire to want to take sides in disputes in other parts of the world, because in Australia, our first obligation is to ensure that people from different backgrounds can live together well and peacefully. And I would want to say to people from both Jewish backgrounds and from Muslim backgrounds, your obligation in Australia is not to barrack for Israel or to barrack for Iran or for Hamas. Your obligation is not to do that. Your obligation is first and foremost, as an Australian, is to act in a way that is fair to all people in Australia and ensures good relations with all people in Australia. So these are issues that are, very important, and we need a lot more, good thinking about how to act on these issues.
Good. You reference to the foreign issues affecting Australia, and one of the biggest foreign issues affecting Australia at this moment, and even this election, is the Trump and his tariffs, which have kind of overtaken all the discussions in Australian campaign issues. Some people calling Dutton as Temu Trump, others calling that you are too weak to deal with Trump. There's a lot of barbs going on, but it's just hijacked all our issues that we face domestically and which are important, which are not being discussed. So how would you take the tariff issue and then dealings with US and China and in general our positions in the global stage?
It's an interesting period, but it's a period in which Australians need to think in a fresh way about what our interests are as Australians, what the national interest is for us. And in the past, we've tended to assume that, first with Britain and then with the United States, we've tended to assume, oh, well, our interests are going to be the same as those of Britain or the United States. Well, they're not. They're not the same. They might sometimes coincide, but right now, our interests in the world are not at all the same as those of the United States. And so this is a problem, I think, again, for our traditional political parties, because their mindset that they've developed historically has been, their thinking about Australian security has meant that they've tended to say, we have to have the strongest possible alliance with a powerful country in the Northern Hemisphere, first Britain and then the United States. And that's the way they have thought. That's the way they thought about international issues for a long time. And over time, of course, we learned that Britain and the United States, as big powers in the Northern Hemisphere, have their own national interests, and they will tend to pursue them. So the United States is engaged in a fierce competition with China over economic matters. And then, as a spillover from that, it's engaged in serious rivalry with China in matters of security. But if you sit in Australia and you look at that problem going on and you say, well, what are our interests in this rivalry between these two big nations? I think the only sensible position you can reach is to say we are independent of both of these powers. we want to trade with both of them. We want good relations with both of them. We don't want to engage in any kind of hostility to either of them. That's the natural Australian position to take. But I think, again, Peter Dutton in particular has got himself into a lot of trouble by wanting to align himself automatically with the United States. And it's not necessarily going to be in Australia's economic interests to do that, nor is it going to be in our political interests to do it. So if you say, should Australia align itself with the United States in its competition with China? I would say no. We should stand apart from that, and we should seek the maximum trade with both countries. We should seek to have good, stable, friendly relations with both countries. And the same with all of the countries of our region. I think that's the kind of natural position that fits Australia, rather than to adopt an alignment with the United States. So I think this is going to become a very big issue in the future, probably in the next 3 to 5 years, I would say. And I suspect that we will see that Australian opinion increasingly moves in the direction of wanting to be independent and non-aligned. And I think that would be a good step for us to take.
In that sphere, you've seen how the campaigns are being run. Uh, what's your view, or how would you think and deal with the scare tactics that are being used in this campaign? This is something very scare. Is this? They'll cut. This happen. They will they go after your money. It's all
Well, I
scares.
think this is, it's something we've become used to, and in a way, as both of the traditional parties have stagnated, as they've become less clear about what they stand for, they become more reliant on negative politicking like this. So Labor's case, Labor basically, in the current election, Labor's message is, we are not Peter Dutton. We are going to stand for the status quo. And if you don't like Peter Dutton, or if you're uncertain about what he will do with Medicare or trade or something else, vote Labor. And that is essentially their message, which is kind of a nothing message, really. But that's where we've got to. And the Medicare one is particularly bad because it's something that Labor now uses in every election. It worked for them, I think, once before, perhaps back in when Kevin Rudd was elected. So they try and use it every election to say, oh, the Liberals are not really supportive of Medicare. They will try and dismantle it. And it sometimes still works for them in creating a scare. The irony is the Liberals have no intention of dismantling Medicare at all. They, that would be a big undertaking. It's too big a policy commitment for them to even get their heads around how you would go about it. So it's completely false. The Liberals have no intention of demolishing Medicare, but that doesn't stop Labor from saying that they will anyway. So I think this stuff is just a symptom of, our political system kind of stagnating. It's now stuck in this familiar pattern of insult and diatribe directed at the other side, hoping that that'll be enough to get your side over the line. And in the process, the big issues about the long-term future of the country are not getting a look in. And that's the tragedy. So the question is, yes, how can we shift the conversation in politics away from that kind of stuff to questions like, how do we become a more innovative economy? How do we reform service delivery so that it's more efficient and wastes less money? How do we develop independent defence capacity for Australia that we are in full control of? How do we reform the political system so that big money can't influence the course of elections, and vested interests can't have undue influence over the political process? These are the big questions that that should take up the focus in an election campaign, but instead it's the negative stuff, it's the scare campaigns that have become the stock in trade for the major parties.
Interesting that you mentioned the reduction in funding for some political parties. I read through your some core changes and things where you said only reduce the political donations from corporates and things, and I liked it very much, especially because we have a maxim that no taxation without representation, and I think you don't allow anyone to fund political parties who can't vote. So political funding should be coming only from individuals who are citizens, no one else. But do you want to expand on those core principles
Yes,
and
indeed. No,
your
I think
measures that
the
you're
way in
proposing?
which funding for political parties operates has become quite a rort now. I mean, it was only in the 1980s that the Hawke government brought in public funding for political parties. That was the first time. And that took the form of a fairly limited amount that was based on, the performance in the last election. So if, however many votes a party got in the last election, there was a formula of a certain, $1.20 or something per vote, as a way of funding that. But over the last 40 years, that has become rorted, so that in the Liberal and Labor collude to increase the amount they pay themselves every year. And they're putting it up by quite significant amounts every year now, because they've become quite reliant on those payments. It's like any recipient of a government program. If you become reliant on it, you will fight very hard to keep it. And so the trend in recent decades has been that the membership of political parties has declined, private donations have fallen away, and therefore they've had to offset the gap by increasing the taxpayer payment to political parties. And, this has now become an unhealthy dependence on taxpayer funding, essentially to prop up political parties that once used to be able to finance themselves. Because, in the 1940s, Liberal and Labor both had over 200,000 members each in a population of only 6 million people. When you consider that today we have 27 million people, and the number of members of Liberal and Labor has fallen from 200,000 down to something like 30,000 or 40,000. It's a dramatic shrinkage. And what that means is that the ability of those parties to finance themselves has collapsed. Hence the reliance on taxpayer funding. So it's all part of a steady process whereby the parties are shrinking in membership and in support, they are becoming more and more disconnected from the population at large. They've become reliant on taxpayer funding to keep themselves in business, and they're becoming more and more unpopular in spite of all of that. So it's a cycle that's been going on now, not dramatically, but steadily for 4 decades of decline of the traditional parties. And, you know, all the current trends say that this is unsustainable for them. You know, they will not be able to continue in their current form if these trends continue. So I think what I hope will happen in the coming election is that there will be a further decline in the electoral support for Labor and Liberal. There will be a growing, an increased vote for others. There will be an election of a growing number of crossbenchers, including more in the centre of the political spectrum who can play a constructive problem-solving role in Parliament. So the more of those, the better. And then after the election, I hope there will be further soul-searching on the part of people who are in both Liberal and Labor parties as to what is the future of those parties. Do they really have a long-term future in Australia, or is their time up? And I think increasingly we will see new movements that will emerge that have some new ideas and a fresh culture that will take their place. So that's the direction I think we are headed in.
You reference to the new movement of minor parties and other parties. One thing which I've seen in the recent state election in WA and now for the federal election is that the independent candidates say we will only ask our voters to put us one, but we let them decide who they put their preferences in second and third. I think like if you are going to be in potentially in that balance of power, you should let people know who you tend to go with in your how to vote cards, who your preferences will potentially flow to. So would you be giving your voters how to vote card on how should they preference other
We
parties,
will
or you let them decide
follow
on their
that
own?
practice of saying to voters that you should fill in the order of candidates according to your own preference. And because everyone will have their own preference as to how to order but not only the major parties but also the other minor parties and independents. So that's an individual choice. I agree with you, however, that it is fair for a political movement to say how it will address the question of forming a government if there isn't a majority government. How will we go about that? Now, I think it's very important for every party to say what criteria it will use, and what we've said is that there are a range of 10. We've put together a list of 10 issues that we regard as very important ones that would be the subject of negotiation with the parties, and it's that's all you can say in advance, that these will be a matter for negotiation, and then based on the willingness of other parties to support some or all of those items, you can then say, well, we will go with the party or parties that are most willing to meet us on this priority list. That's what we've done today. I think that's a step forward. To a certain extent, there will always be a process of negotiation that takes place here, But I would say that process of negotiation should be as transparent as possible. Everything, all commitments should be made public. Everything should be transparent. That's not how government tends to operate in Australia. Most things are not made transparent, but as a general rule, we have the view that everything should be transparent unless there are security reasons for not making something transparent. But everything else should be by default.
So, before we conclude, would you like to say anything else or add anything else to the audience, to your voters, to potential fence sitters who are still making up their mind?
Thank you. Yes, I think it's this election is important, but also I think the coming couple of years will be very important. There will be ongoing turmoil in the world on both economic issues and in security issues. We are in Australia going to have to deal with some very big issues, which we've put off for a long time. That is, what kind of economy do we want to have? How do we want to do service delivery? How do we want to pursue our national security? These are the issues that we will have to address very seriously, and the world will force us to address these questions, because we can't any longer hide away and not have some new answers to these things. So, in answer to all of those big questions, I think what I would want people to remember is that politics must simply be an organised way for the community to organise what we want government to do, so that it does it in the most efficient way, in the most transparent way, and in a way that is most accountable. That's all we want government to do. Government is not there to just run its own show for the sake of it. It's only there to do a certain number of things that we, the community, want it to do. So we have to be very assertive in saying, this is what we want government to do. It must serve the public agenda. It must serve the public interest. It can never be an institution that serves its own interests, that is cut off from or unaccountable to the wider community. And we need a political movement in politics that forces government to operate in this way and forces all the other political players to operate in this way as well. So that's what we want to achieve in Democracy First, in this election and in the years to come.
That's a great message. And with that, I think it's a good time to close.